But you don't have to buy them. The people who they buy. You got it, Francis. You got it. That's why you know about it? I've worked with you. I worked with you. Yes. I think she just if for some reason it gets punctured, then they can bring it back.
Hey, Rick. Ask and you shall receive.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's really fun to see a group coming together. Yeah. Yeah. Glover is outside the territory that's covered by the police. It's a non-profit and they serve towns on both sides of the river.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Ann Galloway from E.T. Digger, and I'm going to introduce Jared Duvall. It looks like he's got a little bit of an echo. Pause is okay? All right. Jared Duvall has served as Executive Director of Energy Action Network since March of 2017. Before leaving EAN, Jared served as Economic Development Director of the Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development, where he was responsible for providing business support to working lands and green economy businesses across Vermont and helped to guide state and federal investments in sustainable economic development via the Northern Border Regional Commission, the Working Lands and Enterprise Initiative, and the Clean Energy Development Fund. Part of the 9th generation of his family to call Vermont home, Jared grew up in the Upper Valley. He now lives in Montpelier with his wife, Reverend Joan Javier Duvall, and their 5-year-old son, Lee. Jared received his master's and public affairs degree from Princeton University in 2014 and a master's in social science research from the University of Cambridge in 2012. I wanted to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming out this evening to get a few snacks and to hear the presentation. So Jared's going to give a presentation and then we're going to have a community in good hands. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Anne, and welcome everyone. Really excited to be here at the Fairbanks Museum. Want to first thank Adam Kane, the executive director here at the museum, and Drew Bush and the whole team that has helped host us here with Carolyn Wesley, our network managers. Help. This is particularly meaningful for me to be in this location. So as Anne mentioned, I grew up in the Upper Valley. I grew up in Fairleigh, just down I-91, and one of my first memories at 6 years old, our first school trip was coming up here to the Fairbanks, and have brought my son, who's 5, I think 3 times already. It's definitely a special part of, for me, and I know for my son as well, in terms of our education about the natural world and natural history, and it's really a Vermont treasure that we're lucky to have. So really glad to be here tonight with all of you. And huge thanks to Anne for moderating and Vermont Digger for this partnership. This is the second in a 2-part series that we started. The first was a conversation about the future of transportation in Vermont that we did earlier this spring down in White River Junction. And Representative White was there. I see you're smiling about that. And you know, the goal of this really is to just help increase awareness about some of the key topics related to Vermont's energy future, how it affects us economically as individual Vermonters, how it affects our state economy, and how it affects our ability to meet the important commitments and goals that the state has set in terms of using more renewable energy and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm just going to give an opening kind of context-setting presentation, and then the main part of the show is we've got 4 experts who will form our panel. You can see their name placards there, and Anne will moderate a discussion with them shortly. But to get started, first a word about Energy Action Network. I think about half the folks who are here tonight are network members, half I don't recognize as much, but we are a very diverse network of businesses, organizations, utilities, fuel dealers, colleges and universities, basically any entity in Vermont that wants to come together to both understand how we can make progress towards Vermont's energy and climate commitments and make progress together in working towards them. Specifically, the state's comprehensive energy plan and our goal of 90% renewable by 2050, and many of the state's commitments to reduce emissions. There are different ones. The one that is most that is the closest to us in time is our commitment to reduce emissions by 2025 in line with the Paris Agreement commitment that Governor Scott made. So in addition to all of the organizations and businesses that make up EAN, we also have a number of public partners, some of whom are here tonight from the Department of Public Service, other state agencies and departments, regional planning commissions, cities and towns, and we work together to try to collect data and information that helps make our total energy or our comprehensive energy story accessible and intelligible and actionable for Vermonters. So these slides just show a few examples of some of this. Is not all. Apologies if your logo is not up here. This is just an example of some of the members of our network. And those members, or I should say the business and organizational members, set a mission for their network. Energy Action Network is really those organizations and more. And the mission that they set together is to achieve Vermont's 90% renewable by 2050 total energy commitment and to significantly reduce Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions in ways that create a more just, thriving, and sustainable future for Vermonters. To support that network, about 6 years ago, a small nonprofit organization was created that we also call EAN that exists to serve as a neutral convener of diverse stakeholders. So all of those member organizations that you see are committed to Vermont's long-term goals, but individually there are different opinions and perspectives on the best way to get there. And so our small nonprofit organization commits to serving as a neutral convener of that diverse network. We don't do any lobbying, and we serve as an independent, trusted tracker of progress towards the goals that the network has set, working in coordination with state and federal data partners, among others. We also convene meetings and facilitate communication across the network, and are really glad to be moving into more public communications in partnership with Vermont Digger beyond the network. So what I want to do to kick us off this evening is give this overview presentation that really has three parts to it. The first is, why does how we heat matter to Vermonters and the Vermont economy? And the second is to look into that question from the lens of, what does it mean for how we can meet our renewable energy and emissions reduction commitments that the state of Vermont has set? And then, and we'll get into this a lot more in the panel discussion, what are some of the resources, if you're here as an individual, a renter, a homeowner, a business owner, a board member of the Fairbanks Museum, and you're wondering, how does this apply to me, and how can I make my home or building more efficient or take advantage of renewable heating options, our panelists are really well situated to give you some of that information and advice. So just to start, this graph here on the left shows the total amount of energy that we use as a state to heat our homes and buildings. Where does it come from? The largest source is heating oil. We use, and this is primarily number 2 heating oil, we use more heating oil per capita than any state in the country except for Maine. So that is the biggest one. Natural gas is about 1/4 of our heating energy use, but of course, those of you who are familiar with Vermont Gas's territory know that that's primarily limited to areas of northwestern Vermont where Vermont Gas has its territory. The third largest source of our heat energy comes from propane. Then we start getting into different types of wood heating, including with cordwood, wood chips, wood pellets. This electric heat is a combination of 2 different kinds of heat that are very different. One, the older, kind of inefficient resistance type of baseboard electric heat that you may be familiar with, still exists in some parts of Vermont, but is largely being phased out. And then on the other hand is the much more modern, much more efficient cold climate heat pump systems that have been taking off in popularity in Vermont, and those are more on the rise. There's also, we have, thanks to the work of the Public Service Department and the Department of Forest and Parks, we're starting to be able to track how much of our wood heat comes not just from wood stoves or pellet stoves, but the advanced wood or the automated wood heating systems that allow you to use pellets directly, set a thermostat, and it works automatically without you loading pellets yourself. So that's the rough overview of our heating sources. I will say that you may have heard a statistic like 38% of Vermonters heat with wood, which is true. The reason that doesn't align with this data is because this is looking at 38% of Vermonters heat with wood to some degree. 38% of Vermonters do not rely on wood as their sole or even their primary heating source. So that's why wood shows up as what is it here, 17%. So that's that piece of it. And then if you look at what this means for us as consumers, as people who have to pay heating bills. This chart shows the average prices for different types of heating fuels over the last 20 years. This is data from the Energy Information Administration and the Public Service Department here in Vermont. And what you see is that this purple line and this blue line, on average, generally have the highest cost way to heat your home and have the most volatile prices. And those are propane and fuel oil. I just looked today at the EIA, Energy Information Administration website for the latest average residential heating fuel prices for fuel oil and propane. And it said it was $2.75 a gallon for fuel oil and $2.61 a gallon for propane. And so you might be wondering why, if propane is less per gallon, is it showing up as more expensive on this chart? And that's because what this chart shows is how expensive it is per unit of energy it's delivering to you. And the energy content of propane is only about 2/3 what it is of fuel oil. So even though it's a lower price per gallon for propane, the overall cost for the amount of heat energy you get from it is higher than fuel oil on average historically. In contrast, the heating sources that have been much flatter and more stable and much lower over time have been the renewable options like wood chips and wood pellets, or wood chips and wood pellets. Those of you associated with schools in Vermont are probably aware of that. Over 1/3 of Vermont's schools and over half of Vermont students go to schools heated by wood chips or wood pellets. And a number of increasingly residences and commercial and institutional buildings are heating that way. And then this line here shows the cost of heating with cold climate heat pumps, which is a very efficient use of electricity. So you see that all of the options that we can map here in terms of the renewable options are lower and much less volatile. The last here is in terms of the amount, the price per BTU is the lowest cost on the fossil fuel side, which is natural gas, which is really the only one of these listed here that's only available in one portion of the state.
Quick question, Jerry. Do these figures take into account the efficiency of the equipment?
No.
Or is it just the
This is just the fuel price. It doesn't look. This does not include the
heat
equipment.
content of the fuel?
Yes.
Okay.
If it's okay, let's hold questions.
Well, just a clarifying point, I actually just contacted Irving Energy yesterday,
Yeah.
and their rack price is $2.01 per gallon for heating oil. So that's a big difference,
So this,
FYI.
it really depends on whether you're looking at a wholesale price or a retail price.
That's retail.
Whether you're part of a fuel club or not. This is the average price as reported to the Energy Information Administration. I think as of last week were the figures I mentioned. So that speaks to kind of what we pay for how we heat our homes and buildings means in terms of our personal budgets or our business budgets. I want to step back and think about this from the macro economy of the state of Vermont. So when we spend one of our energy dollars on fossil fuel, it depends on what the wholesale versus the retail price is of that fuel, but on average, 70 to 80 cents of every dollar that we spend on fossil fuel leaves the state of Vermont because we import 100% of our fossil fuel. So the money that's staying locally is, pays for some of the salaries of delivery truck drivers and the operations of a fuel dealer, but the vast majority of that cost is bound up in the commodity cost of the fuel oil or the propane, and that's going right out of state. Oftentimes it's a global market, but it includes going to places that are not so friendly to our ideals, places that in the recent past have dismembered journalists and interfered in our democracy, like Saudi Arabia and Russia. While I don't have the infographics to show it here, if you go back and compare the amount of dollars that stay in state and recirculate versus dollars that leave the state, for wood chips, wood pellets, cordwood, and electricity, for all of them, much more money stays and recirculates and helps grow our local economy. Wood chips, the vast majority of it stays locally. They're mostly sourced within Vermont or within a 30 to 50 mile radius of our border. With wood pellets, it depends where you're getting them from. If you're getting them from Vermont Wood Pellet in North Clarendon, the vast majority of those dollars are staying local. But even if you're going further, there's a lot of pellet supply in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, or in Quebec. Those dollars are staying more regionally rather than going to the Gulf Coast or internationally. If you invest in weatherization in your home or business, the vast majority of that dollar stays and recirculates locally for weatherization contractors and materials. And with electricity, Burlington Electric Department just did a study saying when you spend an energy dollar on electricity, say for a cold climate heat pump, how much of that stays right here in Vermont? And what they found is very conservatively, 50 cents of every dollar that you spend with your electric utility stays in state. It goes to things like operations for the utility, line maintenance, tree limb clearing, and they found additionally that 75% stays within this northern New England or northeast region. So no matter what the alternative is, if you're reducing your fossil fuel spending through weatherization and or you're switching to another heating source, not only does the fuel cost of that become lower and more stable for you over time, it also has this double benefit of helping to invest and grow the Vermont economy at the same time. We've seen evidence of this from the recent Clean Energy Industry Report that is commissioned by the Department of Public Service, by Andrew Perchlik, who will speak on the panel. And this gives us a picture of how many clean energy jobs are in Vermont, including folks who work in weatherization, folks who work in wood heating, or who work in renewable electricity. It's a comprehensive measure. And what we've seen over the last 5 years is a steady increase. It's been one of the fastest growing sources of jobs in the state at a time when otherwise we've seen some economic malaise. And the average wage of these jobs is about $8 an hour higher than the median wage for jobs statewide. So the median statewide is a little over $18 an hour. The median wage for jobs across the clean energy sector is a little over $26 an hour. So these are good, well-paying, family-supporting jobs that we're growing over 4,000 in the last 5 years. And the ability to continue growing that workforce and that source of well-paying jobs over the next 5-10 years, if we start this transition around how we heat our homes, is very important. So with that introduction on some basics around heating, I want to step back and say, how does this connect to Vermont, the goals Vermont has set in terms of renewable energy and in terms of reducing our emissions? So we have made some steady progress in becoming more renewable as a state in terms of our overall energy use. That's not just thermal energy use, it's also the energy we use for transportation, and it's also the energy that we use for electricity. And overall, we're at about 19% overall as a state. Of course, we've set a goal of being 90% renewable by 2050. So if we're going to get there, we're at a point now, an inflection point, where we're going to have to start bending this curve upward and start making much more substantial rate of progress than we have made in the last decade, so that we don't stay on this kind of business as usual curve that doesn't get us anywhere near the goals that we've set for our state, both from an energy and environment perspective, but also from an economic development perspective. As I mentioned earlier, about a year ago, when the president said that he wanted to pull the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement, something he followed through on yesterday, and Governor Scott, to his credit, instead said, no, Vermont is still in, and became one of a number of states across the country to commit that we were still going to uphold the emissions reduction commitments in that global agreement, which would be a 26 to 28% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels by 2025. The challenge is that even though we've made that commitment rhetorically, we do not yet have the resources and the policy framework that would be necessary to actually achieve it. As you can see, we've only reduced our emissions 2% below 2005 levels as of the latest data released from the Agency of Natural Resources. In fact, we've seen our emissions increase 10% in the last 2 years of data, mostly because of increasing fossil fuel use in how we get around and how we heat our homes and buildings. This puts thermal energy use in the context of total energy use. So as I said, we also have to look at transportation and electricity. The amount of energy we use to heat our homes and buildings, and I should say it's not just about heating. Thermal also includes cooling, but the amount of energy we use to cool homes and buildings in Vermont, while it's increasing, as we're seeing increasing summer temperatures, is still just a fraction of the overall energy that we use overall in thermal energy. Most of it goes to heating through our winters. The emissions that come from that are shown here, and this is a total of all the energy emissions. So a little over a third of the greenhouse gas emissions that come from energy come from how we heat our homes and buildings. And in terms of the amount of money, I believe Rebecca will speak to this a little bit more during the panel, that we spend on how we heat our homes and buildings. Out of our total energy expenditures, it's about a quarter, about the same as what we spend on electricity. So this shows it graphically. These pie charts are scaled to show the amount of energy we use statewide. This is total, the sum of these three. And you can see that energy use-wise, transportation and thermal are very close together. One of the reasons that we have lower emissions from our thermal sector is that it's much more renewable. And we use much more fossil fuel in the transportation sector. The electricity sector has been a great source of progress in terms of becoming more renewable, but it's a much smaller source of how much energy we use, so there's a limited amount to which we can make progress towards our comprehensive energy plan goals and towards our emissions reduction goals, unless we also make these sectors more renewable and less fossil fuel dependent at the same time. Often what that means is taking advantage of the renewability of our electric sector by electrifying how we get around and how we heat our homes. But it also means utilizing our energy more efficiently through weatherization, and it also means smartly, sustainably utilizing renewable solid and liquid fuels, especially our wood resources like wood chips, pellets, and cordwood where appropriate. So this breaks down the portion of the renewable energy pies to see, where it comes from. So most of the renewability in our heating sector is from cordwood, some from pellet stoves, some from electric heat, some from automated wood heat. Over time, what we want to see is not just this section of the pie grow and have our thermal energy use become more renewable, but also have it become more efficient by utilizing the efficient and low-emitting stoves that we have on the market now and automated wood heating systems. There is a big difference between a pre-1988 EPA certified stove and the emissions profile that it has versus an advanced wood heating appliance like the modern pellet and wood stoves that you can get incentives for from Efficiency Vermont and electric utilities through programs that they have. So this shows our historical greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont. As I said, we've gone up 10% in the last 2 years. Not quite at our peak back in 2005, but about 10 million metric tons of pollution that comes from our energy use. And these dots show what we would have to get to if we were to meet either the Paris commitment that the governor has made or the more ambitious goals that have been set in statute previously, or that show up in the state's comprehensive energy plan. Whichever goal or commitment you choose, it's clear that we can't keep doing this and we have to start doing this. The only distinction is how fast are we going to do it. This breaks down our emissions by sector, and this doesn't just look at energy, it looks at all greenhouse gas emissions. So the largest comes from transportation, but the next biggest, 28% of all of our emissions come from building thermal energy use. And these show the others. This is sometimes surprising for people to hear because oftentimes when we think about energy, it's through the lens of national media. And national media tends to not talk about fossil fuel use or climate pollution or emissions from building energy use because it's a really it's a pretty small piece of where our emissions come from nationally. It's only about 10%. But because of our dependence on things like #2 heating oil and propane, in Vermont, residential and commercial fuel use, or basically thermal fuel use, is almost a quarter of what our emissions are. So there's the question of where did the emissions come from, but then there's also the question of why have we seen such an increase since 1990 in Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions. They've gone up 16% since 1990. And the biggest culprits are increasing fossil fuel use in the transportation sector, but then the next is increasing fossil fuel use in how we heat our homes and buildings. We've actually seen a net reduction in emissions comparing the year 1990 to the year 2015 in emissions from agriculture, electricity, waste management, etc. So these are really the two areas that we need to make sure we effectively tackle if we're going to have a chance of meeting our state energy and emissions reduction commitments, rather than, as we have for most of the last decade, expecting most of the progress just to come from one sector that we've set regulations and policy around. So, as I mentioned earlier, EAN, the organization, does not do any lobbying on behalf of specific policies or bills, but what we do provide is analysis around what it might take in terms of the scale and pace of progress if the state was going to meet these goals or commitments. This is just one example. We didn't put this forward as a prescription, but what we started with are what are the known and proven technologies and what are the best practices where there's peer-reviewed data around how we can reduce emissions. We started with the goals that the state set in the Comprehensive Energy Plan, which was around 60,000 electric vehicles and a number around home weatherization and the number of heat pump systems, etc. When we plugged in the numbers, the goals that the state had set for the Comprehensive Energy Plan, it didn't get us to Paris. So what we did, this is the amount needed to reduce, to do our part to meet that commitment the governor made to the Paris Climate Agreement. So what we decided to do was to proportionally increase each of those known and proven technologies and best practices across the board until we could hit the emissions reduction commitment that would be necessary. And while this has gotten a lot of attention, replacing 90,000 internal combustion engine vehicles, gas or diesel vehicles, with electric vehicles, if you add up the total emissions reduction opportunity across the thermal sector, it's actually larger than what we modeled in the thermal sector. And it's because no matter where you live in Vermont, no matter what your heating system is, there is an option for you to heat more efficiently and to heat more renewably than the fossil fuel status quo. So again, adding all of these up. So this just gives you a sense of kind of technology by technology. What would that look like by 2025? We're basically the pace for the last 6 years or so has been we weatherize about 2,000 homes a year. We would need to significantly increase that amount if we were to get towards this number. And that's cumulative across the work that 3E Thermal and Efficiency Vermont and the Weatherization Assistance Program and Vermont Gas and Burlington Electric, that all of our weatherization entities do across the board. We're at just over 25,000 homes weatherized, and we're looking, that would be just, and one thing I should say about this is not a menu of options. It's not, we pick one of these and it would get us to the goal. We have to do all of these or their equivalent. If we fall short in one area, we'd have to make it up somewhere else. And we just modeled the emissions reduction we could get from our energy use. There would also be another part that we have to get from other reductions beyond energy or in addition to these that we modeled. Heat pump systems have actually seen an incredible rate of growth, starting very low in 2013, but you can see as of recent data are gone over 10,000, and we'll need to continue to see that. And I should say, I'll get to this a little bit later, but each home, each building, each heating system is different. You know, what's going to work for you? You should definitely talk with a heating professional. It's not a question of just picking a technology and sticking it in. It really depends on context. Some homes and buildings can be heated exclusively with cold climate heat pumps. Some you want a combination with something else after doing efficiency, and we're seeing more and more complementary systems that involve both wood heating and heat pumps, or other examples. But this is just a model, and this looks at the growth in efficient wood heating in terms of both pellet stoves, the darker color in terms of those, and also the lighter color shows a projected growth in automated wood heating systems, which I know Andy or Emma will talk about during the panel. Those rates of growth of like technology adoption and market transformation, you know, we're seeing a bunch of exponential growth curves here, right? It might look a little bit daunting, but I think it's important to step back and realize we've done this before. This is the story of the growth of solar PV across Vermont in the last 5 years. And it's been the story with any new technology over time, whether it's cell phones or moving from horse and buggy to you know, cars in the first place. So this is certainly possible. It's certainly what we've seen in the past. And there are other examples from across the world that show how it's happened already. So in Upper Austria, they get about half of all of their heating from renewable sources, primarily from automated wood heating systems. They have a population about 2 times the size of us, a similar climate. But the difference between Upper Austria and Vermont is they set a policy and regulatory framework that required emissions reduction, that either penalized or stopped allowing fossil fuel heating systems to be put into place, and instead provided incentives to help folks move to the alternative that was better for their health, better for their budget or pocketbook, and also better for the environment and the climate. But it's a great example, and they say that they did it through sticks, carrots, and tambourines. I will just note that most of the progress we've seen in terms of an energy sector in Vermont becoming more renewable and reducing its emissions over time has come from the electricity sector. And one of the reasons that is because it's the only sector where we have capped emissions. We joined a multi-state agreement called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that required us to stay below a certain emissions threshold, and then required electricity generation stations to pay into a fund, basically to pay for their allowance to pollute, and then those revenues came to Vermont to invest in things like weatherization that have helped bring down energy costs across the state. The challenge is that that is the only energy sector for which Vermont has capped emissions and made a decision to invest resources in providing incentives for folks to move in another direction. Other states and provinces have taken a different approach. They've said, because our emissions and our energy use come from these other sectors, transportation and thermal included, we need to cap emissions and make investments in transforming those sectors too. So California did an economy-wide cap and invest program. Quebec, our neighbors to the north, have done the same. I'm not going to stand up here and say which policy direction is the best way to go. There are different policy options on the table. It's not my role to compare them against each other, but I will say there's a clear message that unless you apply a policy and regulatory framework to cap emissions and then help make investments for folks to switch to the alternative, whether that's investments in low-income weatherization or incentives for renewable and efficient heating systems, there is almost no way that we are going to come anywhere close to the scale and pace of progress that would be required to meet the commitments we've made as a state, and also to seize a very real economic development opportunity to keep more dollars in state and reduce consumer energy costs. So with that, I do have some examples of what this means at a very personal level, but I'm realizing I am over time, so I'm going to save those for later, and if anyone wants to walk through what this looks like on an example of an individual home, I'd be happy to go through that with you, but at this point, I want to turn it over to Anne for our panel discussion. Oh, and I should say, These are pictures of my home. Before and after. Not yet after. But I want to get to this slide, which shows if you have a question of our panelists, you can plug in this website on your phone, slido.com, and enter this code, T287, and it'll allow you to enter a question. And you can see what questions other folks in the audience are asking, and if you like what their question is, you can like it, and it'll move up in the rankings, and Anne will be monitoring that throughout. And if you have any questions about getting on the Wi-Fi, the network and password are up there on the chalkboard.
If anyone doesn't have a phone, you can also participate. We have the old-fashioned kind of question generation way too, just to get my attention, and I will help facilitate that.
Well, thank you, Jared. Yes, so we don't have a motion tonight, but I wondered if each of you could say who you are and who you represent, and don't tell us anything else.
I'm Andrew Perkslick, State Senator from Washington County. And I also work at the department, but I should say I'm here only as a senator for Washington County, not as a person that works for the Department of Public Service.
I'm Rebecca Foster, the Director of Efficiency Vermont.
I'm Scott Campbell, and I quit my paying job, and I took a lower paying job as a legislator, and I'm a representative from St. Johnsbury.
I'm Emma Hansen. I'm the Wood Energy Coordinator at the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation.
So I'm going to be looking at my phone a lot tonight, and I'm not being rude. I'm just looking for your questions, so please use the code up here and prepare some questions for us. This is for the whole group, whoever wants to answer first. What is the most economical and efficient way for Vermonters to pay for heat?
I'd say the most.
Easy question.
Yeah. Well, efficiency always should be first. Saving those dollars. There's almost any home is going to have some very low cost things that you could do just to lower your energy demands. But cordwood is definitely the cheapest. If you have an ability to burn cordwood and can do it. I don't think that microphone is for talking.
There's the
We have to keep passing this around. So yeah, and that's why we do, for the state, we do, and we can pass this around. We do cordwood change-out programs, because people that heat with old cordwood stoves, if you put in a new one, and you can have a pretty large increase in your efficiency of your wood stove. You use less wood, and you can burn a lot cleaner.
Great, thank you.
I'm going to put in a plug for weatherization. So again, building off what the senator said, taking up a home, adding insulation, sealing up the air leaks, I think is really the #1 place to start. Efficiency Vermont has recently rolled out some new incentives, so specifically for moderate income households in the state, which are 60% of our neighbors qualify. Folks can get $4,000 back of a project cost to do a big insulation and air sealing project, as well as access to 0% financing to cover the rest. So now is a really good time to go ahead and do that project to button up your home, and then save. Think about a new heating system maybe while you're at it, but really to try and tighten things up so that the money that you are spending is actually getting your home instead of escaping to the outdoors.
So I'm going to say efficiency also. Efficiency is obviously the first thing that you want to do. And if you can make your building pretty efficient, then the most efficient heating system, first of all, you don't need as much heat. And then the most efficient heating system is actually heat pumps, because you can get a much higher, even above 100% efficiency in a heat pump in terms of converting the heat content of electricity into usable heat in the building. So the future really of building, especially of small buildings like houses and small apartment buildings, is a super insulated building shell, an airtight building shell with probably air source heat pumps, because that's the least expensive technology at least that we have right now.
I'll echo what Andy said in terms of cordwood being the least expensive per BTU, but apart from that, efficiency of course, and then really it just depends on the building and your personality. I don't know what's going to work for you, because you can really inefficiently use just about anything. So, so you've got to pick one that you're going to like and you're going to use well and make the most of it. Yeah.
So Emma, why do you have the talking stick? What would it cost to get to 50% renewable heating sources like Austria's achieved? I mean, what would it take to get there for Vermont? And maybe it's not just cost, maybe it's a policy framework, but what would it take to get there, to achieve what Austria has?
Oh, that's a great question. So what we have right now, I'll say, so Vermont, as part of the Comprehensive Energy Plan, has a goal of getting to 35% of our thermal energy needs from wood heat by the year 2030. So that's what we're committed to. And our baseline estimate is that we're about 21 right now. And that's, so in theory, a 14 percentage point gap doesn't sound that big.
It's not too bad.
Right? You're like, 21 sounds kind of close to 35. Except
It's 90% is like really,
right.
it's tough.
Except that we've been at 21 for a long time. So that's a lot. That's that's a long history of being with wood in this state. So that 14 percentage point gap, that's the real crux of the issue. And there we have a roadmap to get there. Renewable Energy Vermont and the Biomass Energy Research Center just a year ago released a roadmap of what it would take to get there, and it's a lot. You know, we're talking tens of thousands of installations of automated wood heat systems, of modern wood stoves, of big wood chip systems, and so it would take a lot of decisive action starting now. You know, if the 8,000 boilers installed in Vermont every year, we need to convert. At least like 10% of those need to be wood heat. Without their report from me, I don't want you to quote me on those exact figures, but at that time of turnover, we really need to just stop installing fossil fuel systems when we have the opportunity to install a wood heat system instead.
So this might be a question for Rebecca, I'm not sure, but why couldn't we move toward a system like we have for light bulbs? I realize a wood stove's a little bigger than a light bulb, but could we have a buyback system? Could we have some kind of program? That was terrible.
No, you can't.
Sorry.
Sorry, I'll defer to Rebecca.
Okay.
99-cent wood stoves.
I don't know, I'm not thinking of 99 cents. But I think that you're pointing out kind of one of the successes that we've had that makes sense to draw some lessons from. And I think what I would say is part of what led to that success was one, a long-term commitment to the technology, a funding stream and a way to promote that over time so that people started to understand what they could do differently. I know every time they went in to make a purchase. You make a wood stove purchase a lot less often than a light bulb purchase.
It was a bad analogy.
I think it's fair.
I think refrigerator would be a better.
Exactly. Yeah, that kind of turnover. So
Right.
a long-term commitment. I think the other thing that works with all technologies is a focus on building the supply chain. So when we talk about weatherization or wood stove installation or heat pump installation, we're talking about needing to train contractors to be able to perform the work well. That's something that Efficiency Vermont has placed a lot of emphasis on, and it's something that we're continuing to do and really even accelerate now. So when you have a long-term commitment, when you're focused on building the supply chain so that people can make a good living doing this work, then I think the third ingredient is a focus on equity. And maybe that's not as important for lighting or refrigerators, but for heating, we know through a recent report Efficiency Vermont released on energy burden, which is the amount of our incomes that we pay for our energy costs, We know that some parts of the state are more burdened than others. You know, some towns, some communities are spending more of their income on energy. St. J, for example, is the 6th most burdened town in terms of heating. So residents here are spending more of their incomes as a percentage than lots of other towns in the state. So, you know, that tells me this is where we should be focusing our efforts so that we can get to the kind of transformation that Upper Austria got to. You know, we need long-term commitment, we need people to do the work, and then we need to focus our efforts as public policy, as, you know, programs that are out there working for this kind of transformation on the areas that need the most help.
I just wanted to pick up on that, on the chart that Jared showed on the growth of solar. It started in 2010, but we had started working on solar back in 2004. So it took many, many years of us doing the same kind of work, working with contractors, getting folks trained, getting the utilities to come along, Robert. You know, back in the day, they didn't like solar. It took them a while to get along. So I think the same is with wood. Some people still have some concern about wood heating. But as we get it more into the mainstream, we'll really see that kind of exponential curve. But we need to have the whole supply chain, and that's what we're working on at the Department of Public Service. The legislature is interested. Forest and Parks is really interested. Agency of Commerce and Community Development as an economic development tool is very interested. So we're all sectors of the state, the governor is very supportive, are all looking at this as a really great way to reduce our emissions, but also increase our economic development. But we're doing it slowly now so we can hopefully see that exponential growth later.
So I'm going to take an anonymous question from the crowd. You guys can hear me, right? I'm a little bit soft-spoken, but I'll try to shout. What about Vermonters who don't have extra dollars to spend so they can later save money? And to your point, Emma, about wood, and you all have been talking about efficiency too, but, you know, why couldn't we just swap out wood stoves? You know, if heat pumps are too expensive, you know, are there alternatives that anybody can shift to pretty quickly for less money? And what's the cheapest way to do that? You know, if you're going to do the trade, what is it?
Well, right now, they have, you know, Efficiency Vermont has a program. If you meet the income qualifications, you can get a free wood stove.
Okay, good.
And it's a high efficient, modern,
How many people
low
know
emission.
about that? I didn't know about that.
So that would, free is the cheapest.
How many free stoves are you giving away?
So a lot. So the program that we're talking about is one that we've actually recently revamped, and I'll tell a little bit of a story about it because I think it's an important example of this focus on equity that I was mentioning. So for years we've had a program for low-income customers in Vermont who have high electric usage. And what we began hearing was, God, I don't have enough money to be a high electric using customer. You know, isn't there anything that can help me? So we revamped the program and really focused on energy burden, that concept that I mentioned a minute ago, which is, you know, asking people, you know, not only are you low income, but, you know, give us a sense of how much of your income is going toward your energy costs. And if it's over a certain percentage, okay, like you're heavily burdened, whether you use a lot of electricity or not. And so we started this new program that rolls out efficient appliances and, you know, wood systems to low-income, heavily burdened customers throughout the state. We rolled that out earlier this summer, and it's really taking off. So in September, we had our highest call volume into Efficiency Vermont ever. 4,200 customers called us, not only to find out about this program, to find out about weatherization and, you know, different kinds of projects that they could do at home. But it's just an example of when we really kind of find that fit that solves somebody's problem and lets them get started on their journey to reducing their energy cost, that, you know, good things will happen. And we've seen, you know, also some spillover into people kind of taking that step and then doing the next step as well. So it's something that we're really pleased that we were able to offer right now. The other thing that's, I think, unique about it is that we're also working to offer that program to landlords and multifamily occupants. So as long as the landlord signs off, a renter can get access to that as well. So we're trying to find creative ways Free is good if you can do free, so call us up if you think you might qualify, and we'll work you through the process. But it's just an example about, you know, meeting people where they are and trying to offer lots of different kinds of solutions depending on what folks need to take a step in the right direction.
I get to make a comment this time.
Yeah.
So I think the question is, what does a person who doesn't have a lot of extra money do to reduce their energy burden? And I think public support for the weatherization program and for moderate income weatherization is really important. Jared showed a slide that showed the pace of weatherizing existing homes, and it's been increasing, or accumulating, I guess, but we're nowhere near the level that we plan to be. We had hoped 10 years ago to get to 80,000 units by 2020. We're around 25,500. So we're way short. And part of the reason is the lack of funding for the weatherization program. This past session, we managed to put a little bit more one-time money into the weatherization program and also into a moderate income weatherization program that Efficiency Vermont is running. But it's one-time money, and it's not enough. So we need to find a way to increase funding in a sustainable way that's going to get us to the kinds of levels of units completed that we need to get. So that's one really important thing. Another idea is to use. Many of you probably have heard of the electrical generation constraints that we have in this part of the state. The so-called SHII, let's see, Sheffield Highgate Export Interface.
Just rolls off.
Which results in the wind towers on Lowell Mountain and on Sheffield, in Sheffield being shut off because the transmission lines can't handle the amount of electricity that they're generating. One of the ways of dealing with that is to increase the load in this part of the state, this part of the area, so that the electricity those plants are generating can be used locally. It doesn't have to be transmitted out of this area. And one of the ways to increase the load would be to provide weatherized homes with heat pumps. So that's. And there are people who are thinking about how to increase the load around here. Another way to increase the load is to provide more incentives and subsidies for people to get into electric vehicles. So there are people thinking about how to do this. And anyway, it's going to take some creative figuring to get there. But I think we can. I think we can help people who don't have a lot of funding to take advantage of the coming changes.
Just going to swivel back to wooden pellet stoves real quick to follow up on Rebecca's comment. If you don't qualify for the free wood or pellet stove, they can still be extremely affordable. And I think there's plenty of instances where you can might not qualify, but you still feel like you got a lot of cash lying around. And so if you purchase a wood or a pellet stove, so you own your own home, an installed wood stove is going to run $3,000 to $4,000, assuming you already have a chimney, and a pellet stove is going to run about $4,000-ish. But what's nice about a pellet stove is if you don't already have a chimney, you can direct vent it through an exterior wall, which makes it cheaper and easier to install. And then the other thing to think about is pairing that with all the different options you have available for incentives. So from Efficiency Vermont, there's $650 off a pellet stove or wood stove right now. You don't have to have anything to turn in. It's just a $650 rebate, like all their other lovely rebates. And then you could also use the heat saver loan from Efficiency Vermont and VSECU to finance a wood or pellet stove. So as low as 0% financing for 5 years, you could easily install a wood or pellet stove for something like $8 a week by the time you break that down over 5 years. And so then that becomes really affordable. And you get those savings right now. You can switch to renewables right now, easily offset 80 to 99% of your fossil fuel heating costs in your home.
And if you have an old wood stove to turn over, you could get up to $1,000 for a pellet stove or $800 for a cord wood stove.
Yes.
Yeah, so I have one comment and a question for you. I'll start with the question. We just all had many of our Vermont residents and businesses out of power for up to 5 or 6 days. The concern I know many people have, who've expressed it to me, is when there's no electricity, those air source heat pumps are really efficient. When you put in, I happen to be one of those people with an old wood furnace, but the beauty of it is it doesn't have any motors on it. So when my power goes out, I still have heat. And I don't think we've really addressed the practicality, even with pellet or wood stoves. And I know people are talking about, I mean, I've seen more and more people who can afford it putting in a backup generator done by propane, which is on one hand contrary to where we want to go, but the equivalent with batteries is the difference between like $7,000 and $17,000 to $20,000 for the same kW. So I think as we're looking at this, we really need to figure out how to put all this in context, because if we move everybody to all electric and we're not thinking about it, we're going to have a tremendous backlash. In terms of cars, if you put 10,000, if you gave away 10,000 cars, electric cars, you'd be talking about $350 million expenditure. So I'd like us to think about where we're going to get the best bang for our dollars quickest in order to get even close to the 2025. Sometimes I think we miss this simple.
Great comments. I'll just dive right in to say resilience is a real need as a state that we have. I think many different states are kind of grappling with that in different ways and trying to create, new visions of infrastructure that will be resilient. I think in Vermont, given the rural nature of the state and the long distances that electricity needs to travel, that's a real concern, and that we're not seeing at this point many people going to 100% heat pump for their heating. As Jared mentioned earlier, Vermonters like to have a lot of different systems, right? We want to keep the cordwood, we might have a pellet stove, we might have a heat pump. It's really when those things work together that I think we can get to some of the best solutions that are both efficient, cost-effective, and resilient. One of the things that I think heat pumps are particularly good for is in the shoulder season, so you can displace a lot of your fossil system in the shoulder seasons, even during some of the coldest days. You might want to have a fossil system remain after you're using it just a bit, or a pellet system, for example. And really looking at how we can use those different systems to play to their strengths. The other thing to note about heat pumps, a little bit different from the resiliency point, but just again on the changing climate, we're seeing hotter summers, we're seeing increase in air conditioning usage in the state. The efficiency of a heat pump air conditioner compared to a room air conditioner is 2 to 3 times more efficient. So if we're installing these systems for heating, there's also a benefit in the summer as well that we can use to reduce our usage and be more efficient year round. So 2 important points that you raised.
I was just going to say, Barry, that people like to point out, like my pellet system, you don't have heat when there's no electricity, because I didn't have heat when there wasn't electricity with my oil system either. So it's only the cordwood system, or if you have some super ancient pellet furnace that doesn't have motors. But yeah, so unless you're going to go to a cordwood, and that's why I kept my cordwood stove, because I was without power for 3 days, and we got our cordwood stove going for those 3 days.
Yeah, I agree with everything Rebecca and Andy said. I think a really slick system is air source heat pumps with a cordwood stove backup. That also helps when it gets 20 below zero and your heat pump isn't working very well. Another dimension is the changing nature of the grid, and grids are going to go from being from distributing energy, electrical energy from a central generating plant to more distributed generation. And then when you add in battery storage, which is sort of the emerging technology, now you have the opportunity to have smaller cells, microgrids, so that you don't have the disruption of a widespread outage like we experience right now. So there are a lot of ways of getting at this.
What would it cost to double the number of homes that are weatherized in a year?
Answer to that. Where's Zabriskie?
Well, what are we spending now? And then double it. What is it?
It's around 10 million, I think. It's about 10 or 11 million dollars a year. And that money comes, there's a little bit from the feds, the Department of Energy, a little over $1 million, and most of it comes from the weatherization fund, which is a 2-cent tax on heating fuels. And then there's some other sort of odds and ends, but that's most of the money. This past session, there was an initiative to increase the tax by another 2 cents. This is 2 cents a gallon on fuel oil and propane. And it also would have increased on natural gas a little bit. I don't remember the exact amount. I think it's a percentage also. Anyway, that didn't pass muster, and a lot of people were upset about it. Doubling tax, well, it did double the tax, but we're talking about 2 cents a gallon, which is sort of well within the variation, sort of even week to week on the price of fuel. That would have not doubled the number of units to get completed because of the other sources of funding, but it would have significantly increased it. And there's also the issue of increasing the capacity of the weatherization program to be able to use that money effectively. So finding workers, everybody's having trouble finding workers, and the weatherization program is the same situation. And the cost of training workers and outfitting trucks and all of that. So it's really important to have a sustainable funding source so that you don't have a bulge of money and a bulge of needing to hire workers and outfit trucks, and then the money runs out and you have to lay people off. That's really a drag. And that happened with the ERA money. How many years ago? That was almost 10 years ago now. So we want to avoid that. We want to find sustainable funding.
One thing I'll offer from Efficiency Vermont's perspective is that we were lucky enough to be able to deploy some additional funding into weatherization as a result of Act 62 that passed in July this year. And the funds that we're deploying are funds that we saved in the 2018 calendar year for the most part. So we underspent our budget, and the legislature directed us to deploy those savings into weatherization. And I think, as Representative Campbell said, we are trying to work both sides of the equation, both building the supply, working with Vermont Technical College to train and certify 50 new contractors that are meeting the Building Performance Institute standards, working with NeighborWorks of Western Vermont, in Bennington County and in the Kingdom to get more contractors fully trained and into our program for moderate income weatherization. And then also working on the customer side to offer the kinds of incentives that I talked about earlier. And so what we've seen is that with those two pieces of the equation, with a little bit of extra funding to work with, we're talking $2.5 million approximately, we're looking at an 80% increase in projects this year compared to last year. So I don't think that the money has to necessarily be tens and tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars, but even with some modest increases and a sustained effort, I think we can get to the point where there's a robust workforce ready to do this work, and that we're building enough momentum within our friends and neighbors to go out and do these projects because they make sense. The other thing that I'll just note is this year's Button Up campaign is active now, and there are over 50 towns participating, so it's the greatest number we've ever had. Really, this grassroots support where neighbors are going out to neighbors, encouraging them to take steps now to air seal and insulate their homes there are these efficiency Vermont incentives that they're able to talk about this year that are kind of special offer, which makes it a good time to act. But that grassroots support and the fact that there are over 50 towns across the state that wanted to do a campaign like this and wanted to get out and focus on weatherization and talk about the high cost of heating our homes, to me is a really good sign.
Rebecca, you should mention also, we have a button-up workshop here, I think it was last week, wasn't it? 2 weeks ago. But you should mention also that St. Johnsbury, Efficiency Vermont targets certain towns every year, and this year St. Johnsbury is one of the targeted towns, this calendar year, so we're almost done. But the services are enhanced in the targeted towns. You want to talk about it for a second?
Sure. So we have
And Becca's here.
And Becca, right, thank you very much. Good on-the-ground representative. So each year we choose 4 communities across the state where we go in with extra incentives, extra staff time, extra support, working with local organizations, local partners. This year, St. Johnsbury, Swanton, Fellows Falls, and Rutland were the 4 communities. We're going to announce next year soon, so stay tuned. But part of that work, again, on this kind of grassroots level, is just to go out into the community and offer free home energy visits. Really going through, having an Efficiency Vermont staff person come to a home and walk through and say, okay, here's your opportunities. Like, I see your heating system is 20 years old. You should be thinking about these 3 options. Here's some contractors you can talk to. Your lighting systems are outdated, or gosh, if you need a new appliance, here's a place for you to go. Here's some participating retailers that have products, and here's the rebates that you can take advantage of. So we do that for homes, we do that for small businesses, have special incentives. We've worked with the town of St. Johnsbury. As you saw earlier, Jared flipped through a slide. We worked with the Fairbanks Museum. Really trying to do as much as we can in a community and create that sense of momentum and support for a whole community getting together to do projects like this. So
Great.
thanks
I
for
have
the
a
plug.
question for Jared now. When will we see biodiesel heating oil recognized by Energy Action Network as a drop-in ready-to-use renewable low CO option for heating oil users in Vermont? Someone from the audience.
I appreciate that question as somebody whose backup heating system uses B100 biodiesel. I promise you, I did not ask that question. We don't have good data on that right now, and the other challenge is that it's actually both an opportunity and a challenge. That B100 biodiesel can be a straight replacement under certain circumstances. If your fuel tank is inside and it's above 40 degrees, actually Rick Lloyd is here from Lloyd Plumbing and Heating. He did a small nozzle adjustment on my furnace and made it run on B100 biodiesel. I know a number of other people are increasingly doing that. So that is a way to get totally off of fossil fuels for very little upfront capital cost. You can sometimes use your existing system. The problem is the supply. And there are no fuel dealers in the state that deliver it. So, you have
You have to buy a truck.
I go there with my pickup truck, which is not a scalable solution. We get Black Bear Biodiesel in Plainfield. Warren's Energy and some others provide a blend of B5 to B10, I believe, sometimes as high as B20.
I'd be happy to talk to anybody about a B100, well, a B99.
Great. So Levi Warren from Warren's, if you
Please
want.
tell us. Levi, tell us all about it.
On a case-by-case basis, we'd be happy to talk to anybody, here in the audience or beyond about a B99, which is essentially a B100 blend delivered to your home. As Jared said, though, it is definitely a case-by-case basis depending on your system, where your tank is located.
Thank you. Now I have a question from the audience from Emma. Is it true that most of the wood pellets that come from northern forests are exported to Europe? How is this efficient?
No. That's the short version. I think that question asker has probably been hearing a lot of stories about the pellet market in the southeastern United States. And those are in large part shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to be coal-fired in coal plants in the United Kingdom. In the Northeast, however, our pellets are almost entirely used for thermal applications, and they tend to stay much more regional.
Okay, one more question for you, because I think you're the one. Could you talk about the air quality implications of more wood heat?
Sure. Yeah, certainly when you burn wood, it releases particulate matter, and particulate matter is harmful to human health as a reality. Vermont as a whole already has very good air quality, and we are aware of this, that if we are to scale up wood heating dramatically, that would increase the particulate matter emissions. But that's why we have wood stove changeouts. So for every single non-EPA certified wood stove that you remove, you clear away enough particulate matter to make room for 200 automated wood boilers. So we're on it. So this year, Andy, how many wood stoves old ones have we taken out with this most recent wood stove change out?
I want to say we're getting close to 100.
Yeah, close to 100. Okay, so that's like 2,000 more automated wood pellet boilers that we put in this year alone. And so we keep doing this in tandem. 20,000. Whew, that's an important zero. Thanks, guys. I was like, wait, that doesn't sound right. And we're not going to install anywhere close to 20,000 automated wood pellet boilers this year. I wish we were, but it's important. It's important to make sure that we are doing this with best-in-class technology. Make sure we're making room, and not only can we not worsen the amount of particulate matter we're emitting, we can definitely dramatically reduce it by pairing wood stove changeouts with increasing advanced wood heating technology.
Give me your stats on the percentage of particulate and then how much is from residential.
And have a slide.
Oh yeah. God, should we cue the slide?
Where, how
Do we get to applaud when it appears?
Yeah, sure. Now that you've said that, I think you have to. You'll know when you get there.
You compare a wood stove, an old wood stove, to an automated wood boiler. How about comparing it to a new wood stove and also a new
I've
pellet
got,
stove?
we're right there.
Okay.
So if you are looking at the far right, that's a non-EPA, so pre-1988, pre-1990 wood stove or outdoor wood boiler. So if you just switch to a new wood stove, you're going to reduce your PM emissions by 70%, even more so for a pellet stove. You can see that a pellet boiler is pretty darn close to parity with the new best-in-class propane or oil boiler. Next slide, please. And then here, so this is, I'm just going to stand over here. Okay, so what we're looking at here is that residential, so all of us home wood heaters, use 53% of the wood burned in Vermont every year. Okay, so as residences, we are responsible for burning 53% of the wood. However, we create 94% of the particulate matter emissions. That's crazy, guys. What does that tell us? That tells us two things. One, that the big industrial users, so the electric plants, the schools, the commercial systems, they're doing a really good job, right? Those systems are permitted by the Department of Air Quality. They have staff running them. They have particulate matter control systems. They're doing really well. It also tells us that we as residential users really need to get our act together and make sure that we're actually burning dry wood, switching off those dirty old systems, and making sure that our fires are actually burning cleanly and not just smoldering.
Can I show my graph? I only had one graph. There was like 30 here. Well, I just have these graphs.
You never know what's going to come up.
This was something that I had been working on recently. I was thought about it when you were asking about cost. So this is the percentage of the residential price that you pay that goes to either a tax or a fee or charge. So electricity was up around 8% because we have an efficiency charge, we have a low income program, we have a lot of things that we've put on electricity because we regulate electricity. So we said, let's do this with electricity, let's do that with electricity. Same with natural gas, they're regulated utility. We have added things. This is all residential, so there's no sales tax in here. But the fossil fuels, we only have that 2 cents per gallon, and as the price, goes up, then the percentage will come even lower. So as the price got lower, then it got above 1%. But as the price of heating oil goes back higher, it'll be lower than 1% of the cost of that fuel is some kind of government-imposed fee or tax. So it's just an interesting thing to think about when you think what you kind of want to see in the future and how we're taxing it as a state. Next question, unless you guys.
Well, we have a time check, 7 minutes. So maybe we take one question from the audience. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about if we finally get to our target of 2030, whatever it is, what kind of impact does that have on our natural world? The high wood usage, not just the trees, the carbon take-up, water, animals, everything.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'll answer it this way, just to say so that the goal is to get to 35% of our thermal energy from wood heat by 2030. And that 35% wasn't pulled out of thin air, as just something we thought that maybe we could do. The 35% is based on the Vermont wood fuel supply study. And so that 35% is what we calculated conservatively we could supply with sustainable forestry practices from Vermont alone. And currently in Vermont, we're growing more than twice the amount of wood that we're harvesting. So there's plenty of wood. That's not a problem. And in fact, I'd say the bigger concern is if we don't meet that goal and we don't find homes for those products of sustainable forestry, which is really, as the department is concerned, the bigger issue. And the reason that my job exists within the Department of Forest, Parks, and Rec, as opposed to public service or ACCD or any other the state agencies, is this question of forest health. And the importance of finding a home for the products of sustainable forestry, because I don't know how many of you guys are familiar, but a lot of paper mills have closed recently. And without homes for those products, so if you have low-grade wood and you have high-grade wood coming out of a forest, or high-grade wood being wood that's destined to become a cabinet or a floorboard or something else that will travel through a sawmill, and low-grade wood is the wood that would traditionally become paper or firewood or wood chips. And with the digital age and the collapse of many paper mills throughout the Northeast, that low-grade wood doesn't have a home. And you can't practice sustainable forestry without healthy, robust markets for both of those types of wood. And when you can't practice sustainable forestry, that's when we start to see forest fragmentation, as those large forest landowners sell off 5 acres here for someone to build a house, 5 acres there for someone to build a house, a few acres there for development. And that really starts to impact the ecosystem, those large parcels that we want to see in order to keep those ecosystem services intact, those water quality services intact. So for us, wood heat is really one solution to this low-grade wood market crisis that we're seeing in order to help keep forests as forests. Sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded answer.
Okay, 4 minutes.
Oh, gosh. So we're talking a lot about greenhouse gas emission reduction as a way of dealing with climate change. Climate change is going to have an impact on the forests and on everything and everybody. And greenhouse gas emission reduction is really important. But another dimension of that is resilience in terms of having your home stay above freezing when there's no electricity. And there's that. There's culverts. There's electric wires. There's all kinds of dimensions of resilience. And another dimension of this issue is actually we have to not only reduce emissions, we have to begin to draw down we have to begin to draw down the carbon that's in the atmosphere too. So how do we design our forest management practices and our farming practices and actually our industrial practices to sequester as much carbon as possible?
Well, that is how we do all of that while not leaving anyone behind and
Yes.
while not making this transition something that's only accessible for the affluent in Chittenden County. That's really where efficiency Vermont's focus.
Thank you.
Thank you. Final remarks, we got 3 minutes. Wrap it up for us, Andy.
All right, well, there's a lot of things that homeowners and Vermonters can do to make a difference with definitely the thermal, both heating and air conditioning, if that becomes more of an issue. That was one of my other slides, the increasing cooling degree days. But there's a lot of things that you can do, and there's a lot of things you can't do them on your own. There are a lot of programs that the state is offering to help, whether it be wood heating or electric. If you think of electricity as fuel, there's a lot of electric programs. And there's programs for low income, for these things that folks that have a little bit more money that can do if they want to invest in a 20-year investment. To not only lower their emissions, but really invest in our local economy. I think that one slide that Jared had is a really important one that says, if you were using a local fuel, whether that's locally produced electricity or wood, 80% of that dollars are going to stay in the state. If you use fossil fuel, it's the other way around. 80 cents on the dollars leaving the state. And that's one of the main reasons that we focus on it, is because of the economic development potentials. So thank you for coming out.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Ann, and to everyone on the panel. And I want to say a final thank you to the Fairbanks Museum. I meant to mention this earlier, but Adam Kane, the executive director, forwarded some information about the work that the Fairbanks Museum has done over the past years to address their heating. There are 4 buildings here on the campus. 2 of them now. So first, they did extensive energy efficiency upgrades. I think I heard that they actually recently just finished some spray foaming in the basements of either this building or an adjoining building. 2 of the buildings on campus now are heated by cold climate heat pumps. And I'll switch to the slide that has a summary of what has happened here on the campus of the Fairbanks Museum and Planetarium, or Andy, if forward or backward. So that you can learn more about what has happened in this space that we've been lucky enough to be hosted in this evening. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you at potentially a future event on a similar subject. Thanks for coming out.
Are these slides available online?
We can post them on eanvt.org, the Energy Action Network website. We'll post them.
Yeah, we already have a page for this event, so we'll update the slides there tomorrow.
Video's already on your Facebook page.
Yes. But Bob's is probably better, so go to his Facebook page. Get a better answer.
And many of the infographics that you saw on the slides are available in our annual progress report for Vermont, copies of which are on the back table. Please feel free to take the copy with you.
So I want to go.